A hand seized the old woman by the collar and yanked her backward. She hit the stone floor hard. Two guards rushed at her, boots scraping, fingers closing around her thin arms. She did not cry out. She did not beg. She lifted her gray head, found the one man in that hall who had not moved, and spoke 4 words. "Your son is alive." A silver goblet slipped from his fingers and rang against the marble floor. He was a large man, broad through the chest, a soldier once. Now the color left his face. For 20 years he had mourned a small boy lowered into the cold, cold ground. 20 long years. And this stranger in rags named the wound he never spoke of. The Duke of Harrowmere took one slow step toward her. What could this woman know about a child he had buried? "Stay with me." For a long moment, nobody in that hall dared to breathe. The Duke of Harrowmere stood at the head of his own great hall, and not one of the people gathered there could remember ever seeing his face go white. He was not a man who showed things. He had buried a wife. He had buried a son. He had ridden off to war and come home with a limp and a silence that never quite left him. In those lands they had a saying. They said the Duke had a heart of cold iron, and nothing on God's earth could move it. They were wrong. They had just watched it move. "Bring her up," the Duke said. His voice was low and flat. The guards hesitated. One of them still had the old woman by the arm, and he looked at his master as if he wasn't sure he'd heard right. "I said bring her up, and take your hands off her." They let her go. She climbed to her feet slowly, one knee at a time, the way the very old do when their bones have stopped forgiving them. She was small. Her cloak was soaked at the hem and worn to threads at the elbows. She had walked a long way to be here. Anyone could see that. A few feet from the Duke stood his younger brother, Lord Edmund. Now Edmund was everything his brother was not. Smooth where the Duke was rough. Quick to smile, quick to speak. For 20 years he had stood at his brother's right hand. He managed the lands. He counted the coin. He was, everyone said, the most loyal brother a grieving man could hope for. And it was Edmund who spoke first. "My lord, she's a beggar. Look at her. She heard a sad tale in some tavern and walked here to sell it back to you for a loaf of bread." He took a step forward, smiling. "Let me have her put out. There's no reason to trouble yourself with." "Be quiet, Edmund." The smile froze on his face. The Duke had not looked away from the old woman. Not once. And here is the thing you have to understand about this man to understand what came next. 20 years before, Alaric of Harrowmere had a wife named Eleanor, and he loved her the way men like him almost never let themselves love anything. Eleanor gave him a son, a small, red, squalling boy, born in a storm, with a full head of dark hair. The Duke held that boy exactly once. Then the fever came through the house. Took Eleanor first. 3 days later they told him it took the baby too. He buried them on the same gray morning. The woman in a stone tomb. The child in a coffin so small a grown man could carry it under one arm. And before they closed that little coffin, the Duke set something inside it with his own hands. A horse, carved out of applewood. He had whittled it himself late at night, in the weeks before the birth, the way a nervous father does when he doesn't know what else to do with his hands. He had meant for his son to play with it. His son never got the chance. So he buried the horse with the boy. For 20 years, that carved horse in the cold ground was the only gift he had ever given his child. He thought about it more than he ever said out loud. And now an old woman in rags stood in his hall and told him the boy was alive. There was one more thing, and everyone in that room knew it without saying it. The Duke had no other children. When he died, the title, the lands, the whole name of Harrowmere would pass to Edmund, and to Edmund's sons after him. That was simply the way of things. It had been the way of things for 20 years. "You will tell me your name," the Duke said. "Then you will tell me everything. And I warn you, woman, if you have come to play games with a dead child, there is no corner of this earth where my men will not find you." The old woman looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, but her voice held steady. "My name is Hester," she said, "and I am not playing games, my lord. I held your son on the night you believe he died. I washed him, I wrapped him, and I am the reason he is still drawing breath." The hall broke into noise. The Duke raised one hand, and the noise died. "Out," he said. "All of you. Now." They went. Nobody argued with him when he used that voice. In a minute the great hall was empty except for the Duke, the old woman, 2 guards he trusted at the door, and his brother Edmund, who lingered near the wall with his hands folded and his face very still. "Sit," the Duke told Hester, and he pointed to a bench by the long table. She sat. She folded her thin hands in her lap, and she began to talk. "You were away when it happened, my lord. You'll remember that. There was trouble on the southern border and you rode out 3 weeks before the baby was due. You weren't there when your lady went into her bed. You weren't there for the storm." The Duke said nothing, but his jaw tightened, because every word of that was true, and it was a truth he had hated himself for across 20 long years. "The fever came fast," Hester went on. "Your Lady Eleanor was strong, but the birth had taken so much out of her, and the sickness took the rest. She held on 2 days. At the end she could barely speak. But she made me promise something. She took my hand, just like this, and she made me swear I would look after the boy, whatever happened, whatever it cost me." The old woman's voice wavered for the first time. "I have spent 20 years keeping that promise, my lord. I am here because I am keeping it still." "The child had the fever too," the Duke said. His voice came out rough. "They told me he died of it, 3 days after his mother." "He had the fever," Hester said, "but he did not die of it. He was a strong baby. By the 3rd night the worst of it had passed and he was taking milk again. He was going to live." She looked straight at the Duke. "And that, my lord, was exactly the problem, because there was someone in this house who needed that baby to die." The hall went very quiet. "On the 3rd night a man came to me," Hester said. "I will not say yet how I knew him. He put a purse of silver in my hand, heavier than anything I had ever held, and he told me what it was for. The child was sickly, he said. Everyone already believed the child was dying. It would be the easiest thing in the world for the child to simply slip away in the night. No one would ever question it. No one would ever know." Her hands had begun to shake. "He told me that if I did this thing, I would never want for anything again as long as I lived. And he told me that if I refused, I would be dead by morning, and so would the child, and it would all happen anyway, only slower and uglier." "And what did you do?" the Duke asked. He had gone very still. "I took the silver," Hester said. "God forgive me, I took it, because it was the only way he would leave that room believing the thing was as good as done. And then, my lord, the moment he was gone, I wrapped your son in his christening blanket, and I carried him out of this house through the kitchens, and I did not stop walking until the sun came up." She reached into her cloak. Both guards at the door went tense. But what the old woman drew out was not a weapon. It was a square of cloth, yellowed and soft with age, folded small. She laid it on the table and smoothed it flat with one trembling hand. It was a christening blanket, and worked into one corner, in thread that had once been gold, was a falcon with its wings spread wide. The falcon of Harrowmere. The Duke crossed the room. He picked the blanket up the way a man picks up something that might fall apart in his fingers. He had last seen that blanket wrapped around his son's small body. He had believed, for 20 years, that it had gone into the ground with the child. "This was buried," he said quietly. "This was buried with my son." "No, my lord," said Hester. "Nothing of your son was ever buried. I took him with me, blanket and all. The men who closed that coffin closed it without looking inside, because they had been told what was in it, and they had no reason to doubt it." The Duke stood there holding the blanket, and here is where it turned. Because the Duke of Harrowmere was not a man who believed things easily, and he was not about to believe the biggest thing of his life on the word of a stranger and an old scrap of cloth. "Then we will look inside it now," he said. They went out into the dark with lanterns. The chapel yard. The small stones. The little grave he had not been able to make himself visit in years. Two men dug. The Duke stood over them and did not speak, and the only sound was the bite of the spades and the old woman praying under her breath. The coffin, when they reached it, was barely the length of a man's forearm. The wood had gone soft and black. One of the men looked up at the Duke, asking without words if he truly wanted this. The Duke nodded once. They lifted the lid. There were no bones. There was no child. Inside that little coffin, wrapped in an old rag, sat a handful of smooth river stones. And lying among them, its applewood gone gray with the years, was a small carved horse. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the glass. Her shoulders, which had lived up around her ears for as long as she could remember, slowly came down. She breathed out, long and slow. She almost smiled. It was over. The worst part was finally over. She had said the words out loud, and the sky had not come down on her head. She was safe. She had no way of knowing that, in that very hour, a rider was already on the North Road, carrying a message that would bring Lord Mercer to Ashford Hall 2 full weeks early, and that he would not be coming for the hunt. 13 days later, 2 weeks before a single soul expected him, a black carriage came through the gates of Ashford Hall. Eleanor was crossing the front hall with an armful of clean linen when she heard the wheels on the gravel. She looked out through the tall windows. She saw the crest painted on the carriage door, and every drop of blood in her body turned to ice. Lord Mercer had come early, and he had not come alone. Behind his carriage rode 4 men who were not servants and were not guests. They had the hard, flat, watchful look of men who are paid to find things, and paid not to ask why. Now, up to this very moment, Eleanor's nightmare had been a private one, a secret in her own skin. A man who might, someday, somewhere, stumble across her by accident. It was personal. It was hers and hers alone. That was finished. What rolled through those gates that morning was not a private fear anymore. It was a hunt. Somehow, someway, Mercer had learned that the lost vein heir might be breathing under this very roof. And he had brought men and money and the full crushing weight of his name to make absolutely certain she stopped breathing. And here is the cruel part. Mercer did not need to prove she was Eleanor Vane. He needed the opposite. He needed her gone before anyone else could prove it. A dead servant girl is a closed matter. The law does not ask hard questions about a maid who runs off in the night. Mercer was not some criminal hiding from the law. In any room he walked into, Mercer was the law. And every single person in that house outranked Eleanor, except for the one man who owned it. Edmund met Mercer in the front hall with cold, perfect courtesy and got him moving toward the east wing and a glass of his finest brandy. But as Mercer passed down the line of staff, his eyes swept across them the way a man counts his coins. They slid across the maids. They paused. They stopped on Eleanor. She kept her eyes down the way a good servant should. Her heart was slamming so hard against her ribs, she was sure the whole hall could hear it. 16 years had changed a frightened 6-year-old beyond all recognition. She was not a child anymore. She prayed to God that was enough. Mercer frowned. Something flickered behind his eyes. Some half-buried memory he could not quite dig up. He opened his mouth to speak. "This way, Mercer," the Duke said smoothly, stepping directly into the man's line of sight. "The light is going. You will want to see the east paddock before dark." And the moment broke. Mercer turned and followed his host out of the hall. Eleanor remembered how to breathe. That night, in the cold gallery, Edmund found her again. "He felt something," she whispered. "He does not know what, but he felt it. I saw it." "Then we have very little time," the Duke said. "And there is something I have not yet told you." He had spent that whole day shut in the muniments room, the locked room where Ashford kept its oldest papers. And there, in his own dead father's handwriting, he had found a letter. A letter begging the old Duke to stand as a witness against Mercer 16 years ago. And beside it, the copy of the old Duke's reply. Refusing. His father had known. His father had been asked to help House Vane in their darkest hour. And his father had looked the other way to keep the peace. "My family owes yours a debt," Edmund said. "I did not light that fire. But it turns out I have been warming my hands at it my whole life without ever knowing. That ends now. If you are still with me this far into the story, do me one small favor and tap that subscribe button. Long stories like this one live or die on it. And I have a feeling you are going to want to see exactly how this one ends. Because Mercer did not wait. The very next morning, one of his hard-eyed men was found in the servants' quarters, going through the maid's belongings. Looking for a thief, he said. He had Eleanor's small wooden box open on the bed. And inside, under a false bottom she had built with her own 2 hands, was the one thing she had never been able to make herself throw away. A child's locket, dented and dark with age, with the crest of House Vane on the front of it. The man was holding it up to the light when the housekeeper walked in and raised the alarm. He did not put it down. He shoved straight past her, out the door, and started down the corridor toward the east wing, the locket locked tight in his fist, already calling Mercer's name into the dark. Eleanor had minutes, maybe less, because the moment that locket reached Mercer's hand, he would have everything he needed. And a man like Mercer did not need a courtroom. He needed a quiet corner and a closed door. She ran for the gallery. The Duke was already striding to meet her, and they both understood, without a single word, that the time for hiding was finished. They did not run. Eleanor wanted to. Every instinct she had built up over 16 long years was screaming at her to get out the door, into the dark, and never stop, just the way the nursemaid had taught her. But Edmund caught her hand at the top of the stairs. "If you run tonight, you run forever," he said. "And he wins. Your family stays a ghost story, and that man keeps everything he killed to take." Or, he did not roar. He did not throw anything. He just went very cold and very quiet, which anyone who knew him would tell you was a far more dangerous thing. "How long ago did Edmund leave this hall?" he asked the guards at the door. "An hour, my lord. Maybe less. We thought nothing of it." "Saddle every fast horse in the stable," the Duke said. "Wake the men who can ride hard and leave the rest. We go north tonight. If you have come with me this far, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button, because what happens on the road to Greywater is the part of this story I have been waiting to tell you, and you are going to want to see how it ends." The household came awake in the dark. Boots on stone, horses stamping in the cold yard, men pulling on mail with sleep still in their eyes. The Duke moved through all of it like a man half his age. The limp he had carried home from the war seemed to have left him entirely. He was a soldier again, the soldier he had been before grief had sat him down by a fire for 20 years, and the men around him felt it and moved faster because of it. Hester caught his sleeve as he turned for the door. "My lord, the boy does not know," she said. "He has no idea who he is. To him he is Tom the Mason, my sister's grandson, nothing more. If you come riding into Greywater with armed men and tell him he is a duke's son, he will think you have gone mad, or worse, he will run." Her old face was desperate. "You must reach him before they do. But you must reach him gently." "I will reach him," the Duke said. "Gently or otherwise, I will reach my son before my brother's men put a knife in him." He pressed a purse into the old woman's hands, far heavier than the one Edmund had given her 20 years before, and he told 2 of his people to see that she was warm and fed and guarded until he came back. Then he pulled the carved horse out of the pocket over his heart and looked at it one more time in the torchlight. 20 years he had carried the idea of this horse in the ground. Now he closed his hand around it, slid it back over his heart, and walked out into the night. The gates of Harrowmere opened. The riders went through them at a gallop. And somewhere ahead of them on the dark north road, and hours start in their bones, rode Lord Edmund and the men he had sent to bury the truth for good. They rode for 3 days and they barely slept. The Duke pushed them harder than any of his men had ever been pushed. They changed horses where they could, ate in the saddle, and at night they rode by moonlight until the moon went down. Twice they found signs that another party of riders had passed the same way ahead of them. A burned-out cook fire still warm to the touch. A village innkeeper who said yes. A dozen armed men had come through at dawn, hard-faced men, asking the road to Greywater. The Duke did not let himself think about how far ahead an hour could carry a man over 3 days. He just rode. On the morning of the 3rd day they came down out of the hills, and there below them in a fold of grey stone and green grass was the village of Greywater. A church, a scatter of cottages, a half-built wall on the edge of the fields, the new stone bright against the old, and men on horses, down among the cottages, where men on horses had no business being. There, the Duke said. Now, they came down the hill at a full gallop. What was happening in that village was exactly what Hester had been afraid of. Edmund's men had found their mason. They had a young man backed up against the half-built wall, a big young man with dark hair and a stonecutter's shoulders, and he was not going quietly. He had a mason's hammer in his fist, and there was already one man down in the dirt at his feet. But there were 6 of them, and they had blades, and they were closing in, and it was about to be over. He did not see the riders coming, but he heard them. Everyone heard them. The Duke hit that yard at a dead gallop. He took the first of Edmund's men out of the saddle before the man even understood what was happening. His own riders crashed in behind him, and the young mason, who a moment before had been a breath away from death, found the odds turned upside down in the space of 3 heartbeats. Now here is a thing about the Duke of Harrowmere that his enemies always forgot, because for 20 years he had been a sad man by a fire. Before all that, he had been one of the most feared swords on the southern border. And it all came back. Every bit of it came back. He went through Edmund's hired men like a man 20 years younger, and they were not soldiers, not really, they were paid knives, and paid knives do not stand long against a father who has just learned his son is alive and is being murdered in front of him. It was over faster than I can tell it. 2 of the hired men were down. The rest threw their blades in the dirt and ran for their horses, and nobody chased them, because there was someone far more important to deal with. Lord Edmund sat on his horse at the edge of the yard, and he had not lifted a finger to help his own men. The 2 brothers looked at each other across that village green. "Brother," Edmund said. He even tried the old smile. "You don't understand what you're—" "Get down off the horse, Edmund." Something in the Duke's voice did it. Edmund got down. 20 years, the Duke said. He walked toward his brother slowly. "You sat at my table for 20 years. You watched me grieve a son you knew was alive. You let me carry that every single day, so that one day all of this would be yours." He stopped a few feet away. Say it to my face. I want to hear you say it." And Edmund, who had been smooth and clever his whole life, made the last mistake of it. He went for the knife at his belt. He was quick, but the Duke had been quicker than him since they were boys, and the Duke was not a grieving man by a fire anymore. He caught his brother's wrist, turned it, and the 2 of them went down together into the dirt of that village green. There was a short, ugly struggle, and then it was still. When the Duke stood up, his brother did not. "I will not dress it up for you." It was not a clean thing, and the Duke took no joy in it, and he would carry the weight of it for the rest of his days. But Edmund had come to that village to murder a boy in cold blood for the 2nd time in his life, and he had reached for a blade against the wrong man, and that was the end of Lord Edmund of Harrowmere. The Duke got to his feet, breathing hard, and he turned around. The young mason was standing there, hammer still in his hand, staring at this gray-haired stranger who had just dropped out of the sky with a dozen riders and killed a lord on the village green. "Who are you?" the young man said. "What do you want with me? I've done nothing." And the Duke of Harrowmere looked at him. He looked at the dark hair. He looked at the broad shoulders, the strong, stubborn jaw. And then he looked at the boy's eyes, and the breath went out of him, because Hester had been right. They were Eleanor's eyes. The same gray-green, the same look, 20 years gone, and his wife was looking back at him out of the face of this frightened young man. "What is your name?" the Duke asked. His voice was barely working. "Tom," the young man said. "Tom of Greywater, son of nobody you'd know." "No," the Duke said softly. "Not nobody." He took a slow step closer. "When you were born, you had a mark on your left shoulder. A small one, shaped like a crescent moon." He watched the young man's face change. "You have it still, don't you?" The hammer lowered. The young man's mouth opened, but no sound came out, because how could a stranger on a horse know a thing like that? A thing he had carried hidden under his shirt his whole life and never thought about twice. The Duke reached into the pocket over his heart. He drew out a small horse carved from applewood, gone gray with 20 years in the ground, and he held it out on the flat of his hand to the son he had grieved since the boy was 3 days old. "I made this for you," he said, "before you were born. I have been carrying it a very long time. I am sorry it took me so long to bring it to you." They did not ride home that day or the next. You cannot tell a man on a village green that the woman who raised him was not his grandmother, that his name is not his name, that his whole quiet life has been a kind of hiding place, and then expect him to climb on a horse and call you father. The Duke understood that. For all his hard edges, he understood that much. So he stayed in Greywater. He sent most of his men home. He took a room at the village inn, and every day he walked out to where the young mason was building his wall, and he sat on a stone and he talked. He did not push. He told Tom about Eleanor. Not the Duchess, not the grand lady, but the woman. The way she laughed too loud. The way she could not sing a note and sang anyway. The way she had held the boy exactly once and made an old midwife swear to keep him safe before the fever took her. And slowly, stone by stone, the young man began to listen. It was the eyes that finally did it. Tom found a polished sheet of steel the Duke had carried, and he looked at his own eyes in it, and then he looked at the old portrait the Duke had brought wrapped in cloth from Harrowmere, a small painting of a gray-green-eyed woman, and he sat down on the half-built wall and was quiet for a very long time. He was not a stupid man. He could see his own face looking back at him out of a painting of a woman who had died 20 years before he ever heard her name. "She made the old woman promise," Tom said at last. It was not quite a question. "She did," the Duke said, "and the old woman kept it. For 20 years, at the risk of her own life, she kept it. You owe that woman everything, son. So do I." It was the first time he had called him son out loud. Neither of them said anything about it. But something in the young man's face shifted, and after that the talking came easier. When at last they rode south together, it was slowly, side by side, like two men with all the time in the world. Hester was waiting for them at the gates of Harrowmere. And here, I think, is the part of this whole story that matters most. Because the last time the Duke had stood at those gates with this woman, she had been on the ground, dragged backward by the collar, 2 guards' hands on her thin arms, a beggar nobody in that hall would have crossed the road for, thrown down like she was nothing. This time, the whole household came out to meet her. This time, the Duke of Harrowmere helped the old woman down from the cart with his own hand, the way you would help a great lady, and he stood her in front of everyone, and he told them plainly what she had done. He told them that this woman had defied a murderer with a baby in her arms, that she had given up her home, her peace, 20 years of her life, to keep a promise to a dying woman, that every stone of Harrowmere stood that day because of her, and the son she had carried out through the kitchens on a storming night, 20 years before, now stood beside her in the courtyard, grown and alive, where once she had knelt in the dirt. Hester wept. The Duke gave her a cottage on his own land, and a place at his own table for as long as she lived, and people say she spent her last years sitting in the sun, watched over and warm, and that she never wanted for anything again, the way a different man had once promised her in a much uglier way. As for the young mason, he did not become a duke overnight. To tell you the truth, he never fully got the taste for it. He kept his rough hands and his plain way of talking, and more than once the fine people of the court did not know what to make of him. But he learned. He had his father's stubbornness for that, and his mother's eyes for the people the court overlooked. And the old men of those lands, the ones who had said for 20 years that the Duke of Harrowmere had a heart of cold iron, lived to take it back. There was one more thing. On the first night the young man slept under his father's roof, the Duke came to him and put something in his hands. It was the little horse, carved from applewood, gone gray and smooth with all its years. The toy a frightened father had whittled by candlelight for a child he was about to lose. The toy he had buried, he thought, in a tiny coffin. The toy he had carried over his heart down 3 days of hard road and through the worst hour of his life. "I made this for you before you drew your first breath," the Duke said. "It has been waiting for you a long time, longer than you can know." The young man turned the little horse over in his big mason's hands, the same hands that should have played with it as a baby and never got the chance. And the Duke of Harrowmere, who did not show things, who had a heart of cold iron, stood in the doorway and finally, after 20 years, let himself weep. The boy was home. He had been alive the whole time, and an old woman in rags, thrown to the floor of a great hall, had told the truth.